Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're really plunging into this collection of material you've shared. It's quite a mix, articles, transcripts from some high-level discussions, and it paints this picture of a world going through some pretty deep shifts, global stuff, and things happening much closer to home, too. Our job really is to sift through all this, cut through the noise, and pull out what's genuinely important. Those insights, those surprising facts that, make you stop and think.
Yeah, it's a really rich set of sources, and what's striking is how interconnected it all is. You've got geopolitics bumping up against economics, technology exploding, and then what that all means for work, for jobs. It gives you this really comprehensive, maybe sometime, let's be honest, challenging view of what's unfolding right now.
Absolutely. So we're going to take what these sources are putting forward and really try to understand what's happening and, crucially, what it might actually mean for you. Okay, let's kick off with the big picture. This material starts with a pretty stark look at the global landscape. What's the sort of the core shift they're highlighting here?
Well, the first thing that jumps out is this clear move away from, well, what we used to call globalization, free trade.
Right.
It's heading pretty fast towards regionalization instead. And tied to that, you see this drop, this very real drop, in global trust. Collaboration is down.
Which then leads to?
More defense spending. Almost inevitably, it's happening across the board.
And the language in some of these sources is quite strong, isn't it? Talking about a geopolitical scene where the big powers, they name the U.S., and then China and Russia as a bloc are clashing more. That friction just creates so much uncertainty and potential for actual conflict.
Yeah, they really lean into that Thucydides trap idea, suggesting the potential for, significant conflict is quite real. What's particularly interesting, maybe a bit chilling, is the analogy they draw, the period right before World War II.
Where people were just living their lives.
Exactly, just going about daily life, mostly unaware of this huge war brewing. And these sources argue maybe conflict is already happening, in a way. They point to Russia-Ukraine not just as a local thing, but maybe involving those bigger dynamics, U.S. versus China-Russia, playing out right there.
And defense spending.
Back towards 2% of GDP. For Europe, for the U.S., it's a definite trend mentioned.
Okay, so in this kind of world, big players clashing, trust is low.
Yeah.
What do these sources say about strategies for, say, smaller or medium-sized countries? How do they navigate this mess?
Well, the material lays out basically three ways to go. One is almost resignation. It's framed with that old saying, you do whatever you will, we suffer what we must, sort of isolationist. Though they mention Singapore as an example, but note Singapore sees itself more like a price taker. It just has to accept the global reality.
Practical.
Very. Then there's trying to go it alone, the image used as a bicycle, trying to weave around these huge 10-wheeler trucks, the U.S. and China stuck blocking the road.
Sounds tricky.
Yeah, finding that very narrow solo path. And the third option, which seems to be what the sources lean towards recommending, is collaboration.
Working together.
Right. Forming a collective voice through credible diplomacy. The idea is to try and break the great lock, that stalemate between the big powers.
And the conclusion seems pretty clear. Forming regional blocs is almost necessary now.
It seems to be. Yeah.
It's the way to avoid being forced to choose. Fundamental stuff, whose tech infrastructure do you use? DeepSeek or OpenAI,
Yeah.
Huawei or AWS, UnionPay or Visa MasterCard.
Exactly. Critical infrastructure, especially digital, financial, it increasingly demands alignment. Regional unity is presented as the pushback against that pressure.
Okay, let's pivot completely. Another huge theme woven through all this material is tech, specifically AI, and its impact on jobs. The sources almost make it sound like it's not just coming, but maybe a kind of war has already started, and most people don't even see it yet.
Absolutely. That's a strong undercurrent. A major concern they raise is this possibility of they call it a useless class. Yeah. It comes from AI just getting rapidly better, more efficient than humans across loads of different tasks. They talk about new AI learning from sensory input, maybe even surpassing young kids in cognitive ability soon. Automating blue-collar work, sure, but then complex white-collar stuff, too.
And humanoid robots.
Mentioned specifically Tesla, maybe Facebook, with costs projected to fall under $30,000 in maybe 5 years. That's a massive potential shift in labor costs.
That has huge implications. Thinking about new graduates, for instance. If companies can use AI so effectively that they don't need as many entry-level humans for those traditional roles, where do people go?
That is precisely the critical question these sources grapple with. They even start questioning the definition of GDP itself.
How so?
Well, traditionally it's, number of people times productivity per person. Simple enough. But what if the main workforce becomes robots? Robots you can potentially make almost unlimited numbers of with super high productivity. The material actually suggests future GDP might be calculated as number of robots times their productivity.
Whoa. Okay, that is a fundamental rethink. And that line of thought, it seems to lead naturally to things like universal basic income, UBI. If robots do the work, how do people live?
UBI definitely comes up. It's raised as a question we need to tackle. They also touch on the idea of maybe personal AI, helping individuals generate their own income somehow in this new setup.
It feels like this whole shift points towards companies operating differently too, like
Yeah.
small teams, big impact,
Yeah.
fewer people. But those people are leveraging AI like crazy. So companies aren't just about accumulating headcount anymore. It's about finding those strategic thinkers who can direct the AI.
And they specifically call out hiring managers, saying they really need to fundamentally rethink workforce planning, like now, because AI is moving so fast. There's also a nod to, the internal resistance. Existing teams might be worried about what this means for them, understandably.
Okay, let's bring these big global trends down to the ASEAN region. The sources give a really detailed comparison of different countries here. How does ASEAN look overall?
Well, collectively, ASEAN has this big advantage, right? The young population. That's a strong demographic plus for most.
Except Thailand.
Except Thailand, yeah, which is aging much faster, as the sources highlight. But there's a big but. A key challenge pointed out is the workforce training. In many ASEAN countries, the workforce isn't really trained effectively for the jobs needed now or the ones coming. The language is pretty blunt: work poorly, graduating in the wrong fields.
And that impacts productivity.
Hugely. Seen as a major reason productivity growth has slowed right down, dropped from 0.25% to 0.2%, according to the figures cited.
But then there's Vietnam. Vietnam comes up again and again in these sources as a real outlier, a serious competitor. What's making them stand out so much?
Vietnam gets a lot of attention, yeah. Several things. One is a massive focus on STEM education. They're apparently producing something like 500,000 STEM graduates a year.
Compared to Thailand's.
Tens of thousands. Big difference. Plus, they mention a really diligent workforce. There's returning diaspora bringing back skills, capital. There's an anecdote about a suit shop owner coming back from overseas. They also have pretty low debt to GDP, relatively speaking. And they've been really successful attracting foreign investment, global recognition.
Any specific examples?
Yeah, the World Forum Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution and their education accelerator, they chose Ho Chi Minh City over Thailand. That's mentioned as a concrete sign.
Okay, so Vietnam's pushing hard on tech, manufacturing, STEM. What about Thailand? What's the strategy outlined for Thailand in these documents?
Thailand's strategy, as presented here, seems more focused on specific niches, like positioning as a distressed destination.
Wellness, medical tourism.
Exactly. Wellness, medical tourism, aiming to be a longevity hub. Then there's the kitchen of the world angle for food, aspirations for a fintech hub, and interestingly, a strong push for data centers, leveraging that excess electricity capacity they have.
Which came from?
Over-projecting growth in the past, apparently. Now it's an asset for energy-hungry data centers. Oh, and there's a mention of a potential immigration law change.
Requiring skills transfer.
Something like that, yeah. Foreigners might need to transfer skills to Thai East before they leave. It's floated as an idea.
Now, these sources also talk quite a bit about the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement, DEFA. What's the potential impact if that regional collaboration really takes off?
The potential is huge, according to these projections. If DEFA gets properly implemented by, say, 2030, integrating payments, logistics, travel systems, making the region feel like one country digitally.
Then what happened?
Then they estimate it could attract up to $2 trillion in digital FDI. That's investment in new economy stuff, data centers, blockchain, AI, you name it.
And if they don't integrate?
Cut in half, only $1 trillion. So getting DEFA right literally doubles the potential investment.
Wow.
And that would obviously boost GDP per capita significantly, especially for countries like Indonesia, maybe 1.5 times growth. And the least developed countries in ASEAN could see 3 to 5 times growth.
That's massive.
It is. And they underline it by noting, the digital economy is already like 15.5% of global GDP and 70% of future value creation expected to be unlocked digitally.
Indonesia and the Philippines get specific mentions too, right? With national goals for 2045.
Yeah, aiming to be developed nations by then. Indonesia's focus is flagged as green sustainability, specifically adding value to raw materials like nickel into EV batteries. The Philippines is really leaning into the digital economy, especially streamlining digital services across all those islands.
And tourism comes up again, comparing Thailand and Indonesia.
Right. Thailand's huge success, 30 million plus tourists versus Indonesia's 10 million plus, though Indonesia wants to grow that. And Thailand's hospitality, that Thai touch, is called out as a real unique strength.
So the trend seems to be ASEAN countries leaning into their unique strengths.
Pretty much. Almost like a one Tambon, one product, but for nations. Indonesia's green stuff, Philippines' digital focus, Thailand's distress wellness.
And Vietnam.
Vietnam, again, seems to be trying to do all of it at once, which makes them look particularly formidable in this analysis. Oh, and they briefly touch on Myanmar, too, as a sort of collective challenge ASEAN needs to address.
Okay, let's zoom back out again. The global economy. What's the overall vibe from these sources for the next, say, couple of years?
The projection seems to be slower growth than we're used to historically, around 3.3% globally compared to maybe 3.7% average in the past.
But not a recession.
Critically, no, not a recession. What's described as this kind of strange paradox. You've got pretty high interest rates, maybe 3% plus. Inflation still noticeable, 2.73%, yet growth continues at 3.3%.
How is that possible?
Well, the argument in the sources is that global networks are more resilient now, and there are new economic mechanisms, post-crisis stuff that weren't there before, allowing this growth even with tighter money.
Interesting. And in this specific environment, higher rates, but still growing, who does well and who struggles?
The thing that really stands out is the impact on small businesses. Those higher interest rates really bite them, makes it much harder to get loans, access capital.
Unlike bigger companies.
Yeah, larger corporations seem much less affected, according to this material.
So despite the slower overall pace, where are the real pockets of strong growth globally? Where are the bright spots?
The sources consistently point to three main areas with really promising outlooks. First, the U.S. expected to keep growing, projected at 2.2%, but actually running hotter, like 2.7%.
Why is the U.S. doing so well in this picture?
Several reasons cited. One is its unique capital market structure. It just sucks in global liquidity, kind of a winner-takes-all dynamic, especially compared to European markets, which are seen as struggling, consolidating. Plus, the U.S. is seen as the absolute hub of innovation right now, driving high productivity, which pulls in capital, and crucially, cheap energy.
Which is key.
For all this energy-hungry fourth industrial revolution tech, AI, data centers, etc., the U.S. has that advantage. They also mention things like U.S. actions on Chinese stocks pushing capital out of China towards Hong Kong, but also the U.S.
Okay, U.S. is one. Second.
India. India's future is painted as very bright. They explicitly talk about it potentially becoming the world's manufacturing hub, shifting from made in China to made in India.
Why India?
Massive population, obviously, lower wage levels. That combination is expected to help offset the rising costs of reshoring supply chains globally.
Oh, right. Reshoring makes things more resilient but more expensive.
Exactly. Less economy of scale, higher labor costs elsewhere. It could push inflation up, cost push inflation.
Right.
India's demographics help counteract that pressure.
And the third bright spot.
The Middle East, rapidly diversifying away from oil. The sources note 52% of their GDP is now from the non-oil economy. And that part is growing fast, like 4.8%. They're shifting focus to human capital, and they're using their huge capital reserves to invest globally. Buying football clubs is mentioned. And even the possibility of major events like the World Economic Forum moving there maybe by 2026.
Okay, U.S., India, Middle East. What about Europe? The picture there sounds less rosy.
Yeah, museum of the world is the phrase used. Quite pointed.
Ouch.
It means, historically incredibly important, but struggling to keep pace economically right now. Main reasons given: aging population leading to talent shortages, and regulations seen as overly strict.
Stifling innovation.
That's the argument. Hindering innovation, encouraging companies to look elsewhere. There's an anecdote about getting permits taking months in Europe versus days in the U.S.
Is there any counterpoint?
There is some nuance. Some experts cited, like the European Central Bank governor, sound more optimistic. They point to manageable debt, inflation. They believe Europe can still grow if they can keep and attract talent and remove internal barriers, like those inter-country tariffs and regulations.
And energy.
Yeah, the ECB figure mentioned is that 70% of European countries no longer use fossil fuels for energy, so they're making progress there.
And just looping back quickly, that point about supply chains. Reshoring equals resilience, but definitely higher costs. That's a key takeaway, too.
Absolutely. So the phrase used is blunt. Resilient supply chain equals more expensive supply chain. No getting around it.
Okay, so we've covered a massive amount of ground. Geopolitical shifts, AI changing everything about work, different countries, different regions facing specific challenges, finding opportunities. For you, listening, how do these huge, sometimes abstract seeming trends actually connect? What do they mean for your daily life, your future plans?
Well, they have really concrete impacts, don't they? They directly shape job markets, what skills are valuable, who's hiring. They influence economic opportunities where investment is flowing, which local sectors are growing or shrinking. Even the price of goods you buy is affected by those supply chain shifts we talked about.
Right.
And understanding regionalization, like the ASEAN focus, highlights why collaboration within regions is becoming so important for collective strength. Understanding AI means you really need to think actively about your own skills, how careers are changing.
And that point about small businesses struggling with high interest rates, that's not abstract at all, is it? That's a very real personal impact for entrepreneurs or anyone working for a smaller company.
Precisely. This changing global economic map isn't just numbers on a screen. It affects access to capital, competition, opportunity, right down to the local personal level.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, based on everything in these sources, what are the absolute core ideas, the key takeaways they suggest for navigating this complex new world?
If you boil down the conclusions from the sources, it seems to come down to three main things. For countries, yes, but also implicitly for businesses, for individuals. First, AI first. That comes through loud and clear. Prioritizing AI policy, investment, adoption, it's a non-negotiable. It's framed as the basic electricity of this fourth industrial revolution.
The found
Exactly. You have to build on that layer, or you risk being left behind. Things like soft power, stablecoin important, sure, but AI is foundational. Second, regionalization. Really internalizing that globalization is fading and the world's organizing into blocks. So strengthening regional ties like DEFA for ASEAN and acting collectively is presented as the smart way, the necessary way, to avoid getting squeezed or forced into corners by the big powers. And third, collaboration. This is interesting because it runs counter to that global trend of declining trust. The sources strongly emphasize that the countries, the regions, the entities willing to collaborate, sharing talent, sharing knowledge will be the ones that prosper.
even when trust is low globally.
And especially then. There's a quote attributed to Singapore's president in the material. Prosperity is shared. No country thrives alone. So it means actively pushing back against that isolationist tide.
There was also that very specific point about Thailand and nuclear power, wasn't there? Linked to data centers.
Yes, that came up. The huge energy demands of industries like data centers. Thailand has that current advantage with excess capacity, but looking long term,
It's a big question.
it's framed as a serious consideration for future energy strategy. They even kind of cleverly noted Thailand's name sounds like Thai AI, a potential branding angle maybe.
Well, this has certainly been a deep dive. We've unpacked a world that feels like it's transforming incredibly fast. Global power shifts, AI changing the game for work and the economy, the specific paths and hurdles for countries in ASEAN and beyond, all drawn from the material you brought to the table.
Yeah, it really hammers home how interconnected it all is, and the need for adaptability, for foresight, really, at every single level, national policy down to individual career choices.
So maybe here's a final thought to leave you with, pulling together these threads from the sources. In a world where AI is fundamentally redefining productivity, where geopolitics seems to demand regional unity, and where collaboration is presented as the key to shared prosperity, how will you balance using all this powerful new technology with, well, building strong human connections and contributing to the collective strength of your community, your region?